Thank you all for braving the post-snow day to come out and join us this morning to talk about Iraq, a subject that is in the news now fairly frequently, but not, I think, in a way that makes it particularly easy to follow what's going on in Iraq. And that's actually not that unusual, I think, in the history of the Iraq War. We've often had the problem that there's a lot more news than comprehension being offered, but I think that problem is particularly acute today. So we're very happy to co-host this event with the Institute for the Study of War to talk with you about our assessments of the situation based in part on a 4-day trip to Baghdad that we made about a month ago now, I think, something like that.
Less.
3 weeks, something like that.
3 weeks.
Which was an very, very interesting trip, and of course gave us insight and made us hungry for more. So we'll start with and just at the right moment, Ambassador Faili walks in so that I can thank him for setting up the trip and making it possible, as well as for all of his contributions to Iraqi-American relations. Ambassador, thank you. So we'll start off with Ken Pollock from the Brookings Institution, and then Kim Kagan, the president of the Institute for the Study of War, and then I, your lowly moderator, will speak as a panelist and then return to my moderating role, and then we'll have, I think, good time for discussion. So, Ken.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you for hosting this. Thank you, Kim, for co-hosting this. Thank you both for agreeing to come with me on our trip. We agreed that we would divide pieces up, but it's worth pointing out that I think that our analysis of the situation was virtually identical, if not identical. But just for ease of presentation and to give you a little bit of variance in voices and cadence, we thought we'd kind of divide up the different pieces of the analysis. And so I was tasked with starting off and kind of setting the political context as we saw it both on the trip and obviously from our work on Iraq both before and since. And I think that the big takeaway that we saw over there that I think is also apparent in the coverage, and in particular in a lot of the coverage that has been put out in the last week or two, is that the military and political situations are moving in very different directions. On the military side, and Kim is pretty much going to cover this, so I'm not going to say very much, there certainly has been some meaningful progress, and she can describe in greater detail the whys, wheres, and ifs inherent in that. The political side, however, is not moving nearly as quickly, and it's an extremely dangerous situation for Iraq. Obviously, there are a variety of different communities. We tend to talk about Sunni, Shia, and Kurd. I will do so, but it is, of course, always worth noting that there's a great deal more complexity than just that. On the Sunni side, and for many reasons it's important to start on the Sunni side, there's tremendous problems. There's an enormous amount of fear and unhappiness with the way that things are moving, and you hear this consistently from Sunnis top to bottom and across the entire political spectrum. Some of you probably heard the delegation of Anbari Sheikhs who was here a few weeks ago. Anyone who reads the newspapers or speaks to Iraqis, particularly Iraqi Sunnis, will hear any number of Iraqi Sunni leaders, saying that guy doesn't speak for us, that person doesn't speak for us. There's an enormous amount of fragmentation. But the one issue that they all agree on is that no one is happy with the state of political affairs. They do not believe that the government is reaching out to them in a meaningful way, that the government is making concessions, most importantly, that there is a real process of national reconciliation going on that would make it possible for Iraq to unify. Now, that's not an abstract or theoretical problem. And I hear this far too often from folks within the U.S. government that, oh, what you're asking for is, it's too hard, it's a down-the-road problem. Maybe in 5 or 10 years we'll get to actual national reconciliation, but right now we have to deal with the problems right in front of us. Wrong. That will not work. And again, the voices that you hear from the Sunni community make that very clear. But it's also very clear from the situation on the ground, where we should remember that what got this started was the deep alienation of the Sunni community from the government in Baghdad, out of fear, what they were seeing unfolding before them, of a Shia government that was tearing up the terms of the power-sharing arrangement forged by the United States in 2008. Whereby the United States, led by Ambassador Ryan Crocker, was able to bring the Sunni community back into the government by extracting promises and getting the Shia to agree to fulfill a whole variety of different terms that made it possible for the Sunnis to return. Giving the Sunnis control over different ministries, bringing many of their personnel into the security forces under the umbrella of the Sahwa, a whole variety of other legislative, political, and bureaucratic compromises that were absolutely critical in the success of what we typically call the surge. Right? All of those promises, that power-sharing arrangement got torn up by the Maliki government, primarily after 2010. And that's, of course, what allowed Daesh to flow back into the country in late 2013 and early 2014. And while we heard a great many people on all sides of the political spectrum from every community talking about how they honestly believed that Prime Minister Abadi wanted to do the good thing, do the right thing. And by the way, we spent 2 hours with Prime Minister Abadi and came away convinced that he does want to do the right thing, that he understands what needs to be done and understands how difficult it will be, but he simply doesn't have the support to be able to do so. He doesn't have the buy-in from the rest of the Shia community. And there, our conversations with different Shia leaders and what you can see from the reporting on the issue makes it very clear that, again, there's fragmentation on the Shia side. The fragmentation is not as bad as it is on the Sunni side, but it's there as well. It ranges from some Shia leaders who don't want to make those compromises to the Sunnis, who probably didn't like it when they were forced to do so in 2008 and actually agreed with Maliki's decisions to renege on that contract among them, that power-sharing arrangement, to other Shia who I think very much would like to see an agreement put back in place, but are opposed by other Shia and are also deeply skeptical of the Sunni community. And some of them will rightly say, look, we'd be glad to sit down with the Sunnis and negotiate with them, but who do we negotiate with? There is no unified Sunni leadership that we can sit across the table from, negotiate with, and then expect that they will be able to deliver their own community when we strike a bargain. And so you do have these deep-seated problems that need to be overcome. And then, of course, at the end of it, you also have the Kurds, who are glad to talk about, perhaps in the Q&A, but don't play too much of a role in the current standoff on the political front. Although, of course, they can and do play both a positive, negative role from time to time. A positive role because they can be helpful in both moving the Shia and Sunni communities when they want to do so. A negative one because, of course, they have their own interests, and sometimes their pursuit of their own interests can get in the way of forging a new reconciliation between the Sunni and Shia communities. A last piece of it, and then I want to come back to just a couple of quick policy recommendations, is this fragmentation of the Sunni community leadership that I've talked about several times. This, again, is a very big problem. And we see it being played out all across the board, with some Sunni leaders making common cause with Daesh, others, though, obviously opposing it, but opposing it in all different ways, and opposing one another as much as they are opposing Daesh. Now, at some level, again, this fragmentation is not terribly surprising because the Maliki government set about to deliberately fracture the Sunni leadership. And it was very good at that. It was highly effective in fracturing the Sunni leadership. But the problem is that we're left with this fragmented leadership. And it does make it very difficult. Those more moderate Shia leaders who are saying, look, we don't have a Sunni leadership to deal with, they're not wrong. They're not wrong in saying that we don't have the kind of leadership we can sit across the table from. But the last piece of this, and here's where the policy recommendations come in, is the role of the United States. Again, the U.S. is playing quite an active role on the military front in certain selected areas, but nevertheless a very active role. But the U.S. isn't stepping up to the plate, isn't playing as much of a role, is punching below its weight on the diplomatic front. Endlessly we heard people from Sunni, Shia, Kurdish, you name it, all asking, why isn't the United States doing this, that, or the other thing? And I think that it's clear that, as was very much the case in 2008, it's going to be exceptionally difficult for Iraq to move in the right direction, for its disparate communities to make the kinds of hard decisions and the kinds of hard compromises that would be necessary for them to move in exactly the direction that we'd like to see them move in, exactly the direction that the president laid out in his various speeches, both over the summer and then in September. It's going to be very difficult for Iraqis to do that on their own. It's almost certainly going to require the United States to take a much more active role. And that active role is going to be twofold. First, the U.S. is going to have to act as mediator between Sunni and Shia, because it seems very difficult. In fact, so far it has proven impossible for them to do so on their own. Again, despite the efforts of the Prime Minister, who, let's remember, has taken some very important and very brave steps to try to make that reconciliation possible. And we should all remember the steps that he took in terms of sacking various political cronies in the military and bringing in better officers, disbanding the office of the commander-in-chief, pushing forward the National Guard law. There are any number, the budget as well, any number of different steps that he took, which were incredibly politically difficult. We said, you need to do this if reconciliation is to succeed. He did it. But they're not enough. And it's going to require that American role as mediator. The second piece, though, is I think it's becoming increasingly clear that the United States is going to have to pick up another page from Ryan Crocker's playbook, and that is to act as the surrogate for the Sunnis. In an ideal world, we would again serve as mediator, and we would simply bring a Sunni leadership to the table, ideally one Sunni who could sit across the table from Prime Minister Abadi and bang out a new power-sharing arrangement. Again, that seems exceptionally unlikely, given how fragmented the Sunni leadership is. But again, we should remember, Ryan Crocker did not have a unified Sunni leadership either. And what he did was to go around to all of the different Sunni leaders, political leaders, military leaders, tribal leaders, and simply extract from them their minimal requirements. What do you need? What do you need from the government? What do you need to bring your tribe, your group, your followers on board? And Ryan was able to put together, this is the minimal Sunni position. And then he sat across the table from Maliki, and of course, he was helped by his good friend David Petraeus and 160,000 of his closest friends, who certainly gave us a heck of a lot more leverage than we have now, and was able to wheedle, cajole, bargain, negotiate, browbeat, however you want to put it, Nouri al-Maliki into making the different concessions that were necessary to bring the Sunnis back in and make them feel like they were going to be secure, and we're going to have a part of Iraq, we're going to have access to Iraq's resources and political power commensurate with their demographic weight, which is what we're going for here. The last point I will make on this is that I think this is all doable. We were struck by how, and I'm going to just be a little bit vague here, American diplomats in Baghdad both recognized these problems, were eager to take them on, but as they said, and as we all recognized, they're going to need some help. They're going to need some leverage. They're going to need some additional resources so that they've got cards to play in these negotiations. And in part because we need to recognize that many of the demands made by the Sunnis and many of the demands made by the Shia are going to be difficult to reconcile. At some level, they will probably be impossible to reconcile. They are born of fear and mistrust, and we all know it's almost impossible to make people who've gone through what Iraqis went through feel completely safe and secure. And so a big part of making that negotiation successful may be for the United States to come in and say, we'll take care of that problem or this issue, or we will give you this other compensating thing that will help you to sell the deal to your community because the other side can't do it. Right? And by us, I don't literally mean just the United States. It obviously needs to be a coalition effort. There are European countries, East Asian countries, Arab countries, all of whom can and should be brought into this process. So it's not entirely the United States who's putting up all of the resources behind this. This is a global problem, and there is a global community out there who can and should be willing to contribute to it. Let me stop there.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming out. It is an honor and pleasure to co-host this with AEI, and thank you, Ken, very much for your remarks. I actually would like to take the time to talk about the security situation inside of Iraq, and actually I would like to begin with the Iraqi security forces themselves. Because I think one of the most striking changes and most striking insights that I gained through the travels through Baghdad is that the American perception that there are no Iraqi security forces is false to fact. That in point of fact, although the Iraqi security forces took some extraordinary losses in the collapse of Mosul, there is actually still an Iraqi army that is left, that is at the core of the Iraqi state and the Iraqi security system. And frankly, this was a surprise to me, but an important one that I think we should keep in mind as we wrestle with the nature of the security environment and the challenges that it faces. And moreover, this Iraqi security force, in its leadership, was actually behaving differently from the Iraqi security forces that I last encountered in Iraq in 2010 or 2011 on my last trip. And that leadership was different in a number of ways, not least of which because Prime Minister Abadi had actually abolished the office of the Commander-in-Chief, which was the institution that Prime Minister Maliki had used in order to bypass the official chain of command of the Iraqi security forces. And he had used it to micromanage the security force operations all over the country through an irregular set of command and control methods. What that meant is that the institutions of the Iraqi security forces that were supposed to have power, responsibility, and accountability for securing the country were not actually in charge of security. And the Ministry of Defense, as it was constituted, and the Iraqi army as it was constituted, under the Maliki regime, did not actually have the ability to set the terms of operations. So this important step that Ken had mentioned earlier of abolishing the office of the Commander-in-Chief has actually transformed the institutional vitality of the Defense Ministry in particular and the Iraqi army in particular, such that leaders who we had encountered in the past as essentially ineffective and just going about the motions of their job were actually invigorated at the prospect of engaging in the security of their country. And in addition, these leaders within the Iraqi army and the defense ministry had actually gone through the process of deriving lessons from the failures that they had experienced with the fall of Fallujah and then with the collapse of Mosul. So that, in fact, as we spoke to ministry officials and generals alike, we actually got very honest assessments from each of them about the failure of the Iraqi army to secure Mosul and to react properly, with a diagnosis of leadership failures, a diagnosis of really failure to train and sustain the security forces in the proper way. Some responsibility to politicians, but equal responsibility to leaders within the security forces who had not fulfilled their responsibilities in leading their troops up in Mosul. And it was striking to me that the Iraqi army leadership and the ministerial leadership could be so honest about a failure so recent and could be forthcoming about it in a way that did not reflect one official line, but rather their own personal observations of what had happened and the lessons they had derived from it. Such that we have in the Iraqi security force leadership a learning force, which is something that we value so much here in the United States. It is also a learning force in the sense that it has it still retains in its senior leaders some experience with the counterinsurgency fight of 2007, 2008, and 2009, the period that we think of as the surge. And that is actually something that the military planners who are considering how to approach the fight against ISIS, particularly in its stronghold of Mosul, are actually bringing into their discussions of planning and considerations for what will need to be achieved. And I actually want to circle back on that in a moment as we really talk about what is needed to achieve that kind of security within Iraq against ISIS, because I actually am concerned about the extraordinary resilience of ISIS, even against the operations that the Iraqi security forces, backed by coalition elements, and frankly, backed by Iranian Shia militias, are undertaking on the ground. You know, we have indeed seen territorial recovery from ISIS into the hands of nominally government forces. A lot of times the government forces that are retaking areas are not actually government forces at all, but Shia militias, and I'll let Fred elaborate on this in just a bit. But certainly ISIS has lost control of terrain that it had gained in the June, July, and August timeframe as a result of sustained military operations. And we've seen this in areas such as the south of Baghdad and the southern Baghdad belt. We've seen this in critical zones for Shia, such as the area around Samarra. And we've seen this also in Diyala province, which is a critical frontier, frankly, for the Iranians, because it's the border terrain between them and Iraq in the Sunni Shia Kurdish mixed areas. We have nevertheless seen ISIS continue its counteroffensives and be quite resilient at regrouping in the face of these military successes against it, such that whereas we can talk about the loss of terrain in some of these areas, what we are seeing on a consistent basis is that ISIS is actually trying to retake terrain that it has lost, and that in many circumstances, the Iraqi security forces and the Shia militias are not actually able to retain and control the areas that they have seized. And therefore, ISIS is able to whittle back the gains that are made. And we've seen this in places like Beji, we've seen this in places like Tikrit, and we are seeing it most of all right now in Anbar province, which is the main effort main offensive effort that ISIS is leading, and its operations underway have made headlines over the past week as they attacked the town of Baghdad, which is near Al-Assad Air Base in Anbar, and have conducted a very sophisticated operation against the Iraqi security forces and the U.S. and coalition forces that are there. ISIS is resilient, and it is not on the defensive. It is actually on a counteroffensive in order to retain and expand its territories. That's its stated objective, according to its official statements. So as we look forward at this military campaign and the regaining of this terrain by Iraqi security forces and Shia militias, we need to recognize that ISIS is really one of the most resilient organizations that we have encountered. It was, after all, formerly Al-Qaeda in Iraq. We did actually more or less defeat it in 2008, 2009, and here we are in 2015, and it is back, not only with an increase in footprint inside Iraq, but with a global footprint as well. So what should be done about this? Well, U.S. officials continue to talk about an operation to clear Mosul as being what they would define as the decisive component of the military campaign against ISIS. And certainly, it is extremely important to get ISIS out of Mosul. It is a major city. It is an important city, it is a historic city, and it is a source of strength for ISIS that it controls such a prominent urban area. Nevertheless, conditions have not been set for successful operations inside of Mosul. And I think it is really important, on the one hand, to recognize the urgency of clearing Mosul, but on the other hand, actually to allow military planners and thinkers to devise a campaign that will actually succeed in its objectives over the long term, even if that campaign does not begin instantaneously and according to the timelines that we all would love. Rather, in point of fact, as we take a look at Mosul, we have an urban area that, frankly, the United States was not able to clear and hold very well back in 7, 8, and 9. We have ISIS actually digging in, creating and establishing fortifications, creating defensive areas, and moving headquarters around. We have a population that is either supportive of ISIS or living in terror. And we have, in fact, a major city which has been partially destroyed by ISIS. And so the clearing of Mosul is a major campaign. It's not just a military campaign. It has got to have a hold component, it's got to have a reconstruction component, and it has got to go hand in hand with enough political reconciliation to make it less permeable to ISIS, which will, in fact, not be completely destroyed at the end of a Mosul clearing operation, but will, in our assessment at ISW, pull back into neighboring areas, into Syria, and relaunch itself in a terrorist and guerrilla way, rather than in this kind of semi-conventional way that it is organized in northern Iraq right now. So that means that there's good news and bad news on the security front inside of Iraq. There is huge potential within the security forces. That potential is undercut by Shia militias, as Fred will discuss. There is a huge new atmosphere, and there is good morale. It needs to be matched with an actual success on the ground, and that success on the ground is going to require a really sophisticated coordinated set of plans in which military and political officials actually participate in a way that allows the rebuilding of Iraq. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks, Ken. I want to first pull together a couple of strands that my colleagues put out to highlight the fact that because the Obama administration has defined the U.S. mission in Iraq and U.S. interests in Iraq so incredibly narrowly to be ISIS, only ISIS, and nothing but ISIS, we are at serious risk of having a situation where the operation is successful and the patient dies. That will be failure for the United States because, as Kim pointed out, and we cannot overstate this enough, ISIS is simply the most recent incarnation of one of the most resilient and vicious and brutal terrorist organizations, now terrorist armies, that we've ever seen. And if we do not get the rebuilding right, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute because it's very important to highlight that, if we do not get the kind of political settlement that Ken is talking about, we will have son of ISIS. It will regrow, especially because there is absolutely no meaningful plan in place to do anything serious to ISIS in Syria. And so we are going to have an ISIS continuing to control territory on Iraq's border. And that means that we are going to continue to have ISIS or son of ISIS in Iraq unless Iraqi society and political system has been rebuilt in some way to make it actually resistant. So one thing I want to be very clear about is that if we continue to pursue the strategy as the administration has defined it, which is that the only thing we're trying to do is defeat ISIS, then we may defeat ISIS militarily, but we will lose again. And we will face this problem again soon. And I think it's very important to highlight that. I also think it's incredibly important to highlight the magnitude of the damage that's been done to Iraq again in the context of virtually no interest on the part of this administration or the international community in providing any additional assistance to help Iraq rebuild this time. It was one thing to talk about Iraq having the money to rebuild when oil was at $115 a barrel. It is another thing entirely to talk about Iraq having the money to rebuild itself when oil is at $50 or $60 a barrel. Iraq actually has a major budget crisis. This is something that was being mentioned to us repeatedly. It's apparent from anybody who understands anything about oil-dependent states. And this war is destroying infrastructure and is creating millions of internally displaced people, by the way, of a very different variety from what we had seen in the past. Historically, Iraq has been able to absorb IDPs remarkably well by usually people leave an area and go to stay with family or friends or something elsewhere, and you don't have actually, we didn't have, large IDP camps. We didn't have, just communities that were entirely internally displaced peoples with no referent. We have that now. They have that now. That's a new phenomenon. It's not something Iraqis are used to dealing with. It's not something that any state finds it easy to deal with. There's no plan in place and no thinking about a plan that I'm aware of by the international community to provide any kind of assistance or even recognize that this is a problem. And yet, if those IDPs are not resettled in an intelligent way, then again, the groundwork will be laid for the resurgence of this insurgency and others. So on the Iranian side, it was fascinating to go to Baghdad and see that things were both worse and better than I had assessed. And that's, of course, one of the wonderful things about being able to get there, and why I'm grateful that Ken dragged us into this trip and that Ambassador Filey made it possible and Prime Minister Abadi hosted us. So attend me carefully. I'm going to make an argument which I'm then going to refute. Okay? You can make an argument about the degree to which Iran is dominant in Iraq and it's game over, and it's not hard. It goes something like this. When you drive from the airport to the green zone, virtually every single checkpoint that you go by has sectarian banners over it, pictures of Imam Hussein, often pictures of Hassan, of Ali, even over Iraqi army checkpoints, Iraqi federal police checkpoints. These are not militia checkpoints. Baghdad from the airport to the Green Zone looks like a Shiaized city in a way that I have not seen it previously, and in a way that I think would be very problematic for reconciliation. We were told that it's not like that in the Sunni neighborhoods, but we were not able to visit them, or we didn't visit them, and so I can't verify that. I would hope that that's true, but I think it's a problem nevertheless that any Sunni coming into the Green Zone is confronted by this degree of sectarian imagery. That's sectarian, that's not Iranian. The Iranian stuff is actually in the heart of the Green Zone, and outside of the headquarters of major political parties and senior Iraqi politicians, in addition to the large billboard with a picture of Ayatollah Khamenei, there is now also a large billboard with a picture of IRGC Brigadier General Taghavi, who was killed fighting around Samarra, and at the bottom of that picture is an IRGC logo. That is something that I haven't seen in Iraq before, and that attests to a degree of Iranian control. Yes, we spoke with Iraqi politicians and really just Iraqi politicians who said, yes, Qasem Soleimani was sitting where you're sitting. He comes in periodically and we talk. He has a house in the Green Zone. He has this and that and the other thing. And of course, it's well known that Iranian controlled militias now, such as the Badr Corps, Asaib al-Haq, Kataib Hezbollah, are in control of territory and out of the control of the Iraqi government. And that's one of the dynamics that we have seen emerge here that is actually new. We always knew and assessed that those organizations were Iranian proxies. We always knew and assessed that Hadi al-Amri, the head of the Badr Corps, was working very closely, shall we say, with Haji Qasem Soleimani. That Mohandas, the head of Kataib Hezbollah, was basically working for Haji Qasem. Qais Khazali with AH has always been a little bit more complicated, but his close ties to Iran were never really in doubt, especially after we picked him up in 2007 with Ali Musa Dakduk, one of the leading Lebanese Hezbollah guys who was an Iranian go-between. So it's not news to anyone that these guys are Iranian proxies. The way they've been behaving and their militias have been behaving during this crisis, however, is new. And they have been flaunting their independence from the central government. And they have been making much of themselves, especially Hadi al-Amri and Mohandas, in a way that previously, especially Mohandas, had not been doing. So it looks like you have a very prominent degree of Shia militia control, and it looks like the Shia militias are pervasive. We also have the phenomenon of popular mobilization units. These are the tens of thousands of Iraqis who responded when Grand Ayatollah Sistani issued his fatwa calling on Iraqis to mobilize against ISIS. It is easy from here to look at these groups and imagine that they're all co-opted by one or more of these Iranian militias and say, look, so there's 80,000 some odd of them, and so there's 80,000 Iranian militias, that are controlled by Haji Qasem in Iraq, and basically the Iranians control the security forces. That's the argument that I am making in order to refute partially. So please don't quote me saying that the Iranians are fully in control of the Iraqi security forces, because I'm actually making the exact opposite case. What we found, not surprisingly, is that things are much more nuanced on the ground. So in Diyala, Hadi al-Amri and the Badr Corps are the security force, and the Iraqi security forces there largely behave as though they're subordinate to the Badr Corps. And Hadi al-Amri really doesn't make very many bones about whom he's reporting to, and it isn't Prime Minister Abadi. AAH and KH don't operate geographically in the same way. They operate more like special forces in the manner of other Iranian high-end proxies. And so you can't really pin them down. They don't control territory in the same way. But it became pretty clear to us that the degree of integration between these Iranian militias and the Iraqi army was less than we had assessed outside of Diyala and possibly a couple of small pockets in the immediate vicinity of Baghdad. That gave us a lot more optimism than we had had. So in addition to discovering that there actually is an Iraqi army that is emotionally reconstituting itself with an honest narrative about what happened and looking to fix the flaws that led to its stunning defeat, we also found an Iraqi army that we do not assess to be controlled by the Iranians, and on the contrary, that seeks to be allied with the United States and looks to the United States for support for a number of reasons, including that we trained it, and it's a professional force. And the Iranian method of operating is antithetical to that. The Iranians are very lethal. They train their guys very well, but they fight in a completely different way from the way that we fight and from the way that the Iraqi army has been trained to fight. And the Iraqi army doesn't think that that's the appropriate way to fight, and they're right. And they have imbibed the lessons of counterinsurgency, and let's just say that the Iranian record on counterinsurgency is not so hot. Certainly, the Iranian evolution of counterinsurgency theory is a bit thin. So that's one of the reasons why we see an opportunity in a cleft between the Iranians and what they're offering militarily and the Iraqi army. Now, I think when you get into the police, it's more complicated. When you get into the popular mobilization units, it's even more complicated, but this was also fascinating to us. Clearly, some of those recruits went into AAH, KH, and so forth, but I don't think it was very many. A lot of those popular mobilization units are just popular mobilization units. They are composed of Shia largely. They were mobilized by the fatwa, but they're not directly under the control of a single militia. In some cases, they're more loyal to a political party, and that's the other phenomenon that emerged that I think is very important, that all of the Shia political leaders that we spoke to made it clear that they regard the Iranian-controlled militias as a threat to them. And they are right, because the degree to which the Iranian-controlled militias have made it clear that they are not responsive to a body, they are making it clear that they're not responsive to any of the Shia political leaders either. They've made it clear that they're actually not responsive to Sistani either. And that is a problem for Iraq's Shia political leaders. They are threatened by these guys. And one of the things that I was surprised to discover is that there was a certain enthusiasm among Shia political leaders for the National Guard law because they saw it as a way of trying to demobilize these militias, deal with them in some way, bring them back under control, all of which I can use a shorthand for and say regain Iraq's actual sovereignty from Iran. And that was, again, a theme that was reinforced for me. Mohandas is not a major figure, or wasn't a major figure on the Iraqi scene. Hadi al-Amiri is very far from being a dominant political figure in Iraq or having a long history of being even an effective politician, shall we say. When these guys are strutting around, as they have been, publicly making much of themselves, it's first of all insulting to the Iraqi Shia political leaders who actually represent communities and are not Iranian proxies, but it also makes it look like the Iranians are managing a satrapy in Iraq in the manner of the old Persian Empire, and these upstarts are posing as the satraps, which, by the way, I think is the way they view things. That doesn't go over very well. And so the Iranians are helping us out in their usual ham-fisted approach to dealing with Arabs, which for all of their years of familiarity with the region, they simply can never get under control. And they are antagonizing Shia political leaders, and I think elements of the Shia community, that do not want to become Persified and do not want to be ruled from Tehran, and certainly do not want to be ruled from Tehran via the Quds Force, via satraps like Mohandas and Hadi al-Amiri and their crew. That, again, offers us an opportunity. But we heard other counter-narratives from Iraqi Shia political leaders that were very important and that are valid. One of them was, what did you expect us to do? When Mosul fell, the Iranians were here the next day, and you were nowhere to be found. What did you want us to do? They were here. The situation changed. They're still here. Where are you? You're not conducting operations near the Shia areas. most of your airstrikes are in the north, which is largely true, supporting the Kurds. And all of the narrative that we spin here in DC about how the Kurds are our best friends and we need to help the Kurds and we should arm the Kurds and stuff, the Shia hear that and they say, so, I'm sorry, how does this work for us exactly? What are you actually offering us? And then, of course, there's the problem that they are getting not mixed messages from the White House about relations with Iran, but straightforward messages, pretty much, because the White House message about Iran across the region generally is, yeah, we should work with Iran. There's certainly no indication that I've picked up publicly or privately that at any time the senior White House official has said to an Iraqi leader, you need to not work closely with Tehran. You need to not get in bed with them. You need to be independent. We think you should be independent, that kind of stuff. That's not the White House policy. So, not surprisingly, there's confusion among the Shia political leadership about what it is exactly that the United States wants. That's unfortunate, because I think that if we recognized the opportunity, first of all, if we recognize the actual importance of sustaining Iraq as a unitary state that is independent of us, but that is also independent of Iran, we'd be miles ahead of where we actually are in our policy. It is, in fact, a disaster for the United States if Shia Iraq and Baghdad become a Persian satrapy for all kinds of reasons, including that it will drive ISIS. And the recent assassination, ostentatiously by an Iranian militia of a Sunni sheikh in Baghdad, highlights that. This is the modus operandi of Iran's preferred proxies. So I'm not telling you that Iraq needs to be independent of Iran because I don't like the Iranians. I'm telling you that Iraq needs to be independent of Iran because the Iranians will drive and support policies that will drive ISIS and al-Qaeda recruitment and inflame sectarian tensions and cause the problems that have brought us there in the first place. It is not an acceptable solution for the United States because it will not achieve any of our core interests. It would be great if we would start by recognizing that fact. What would follow from that would be, what can we offer to Iraq, Shia, Sunni, and Kurds that the Iranians can't offer? The answer is a lot. We have an enormous amount of capability, some of it military, some non-military, that we could be providing. We should be providing. We should be leaning in, and we should be making clear that we stand by all of Iraq's communities, not just some of them, against ISIS and against Iran, and that we're prepared to make a contribution that Iran can't match. And I think that if we were to do that, outlandish though that sounds in the current Washington environment, we would have an opportunity again of peeling the Iraqi leadership, I think, away from Iran and peeling the Sunni away from ISIS and reforming an Iraqi state that I still believe could be viable if the right choices were made in Baghdad and Washington and elsewhere. Go ahead, Ken.
Thanks so much. That was incredibly eloquent, and it allows me, I just want to wrap everything else up in a way that I wasn't able to by starting things off, and simply say, reinforce a point that Fred was making, which is that, there's the constant theme that we hear in Washington, and I get confronted with all the time, is the American people are not really interested in dealing with Iraq's civil war. We just want to defeat ISIS, and that'll be good enough, and we can go home. And I hope that what you got from the three of us is just how utterly misguided that whole sentiment is. It's not possible. You want to defeat ISIS, fine, I get that. Defeating ISIS is actually about a lot more than Iraq. As Fred pointed out, it's about Syria. It's about, and let's remember, ISIS is nothing more, as Kim was suggesting, than the latest manifestation, and just one manifestation, of a wider Salafist rejectionist trend that is a huge Middle East-wide effort that is not limited to Iraq. So even if you crush it in Iraq, you haven't crushed it, and you haven't dealt, even if you crush ISIS, you haven't dealt with the wider problem. But beyond that, by the same token, you cannot defeat ISIS even in Iraq without dealing with the Iraqi civil war. It's simply not possible. As Kim pointed out, we've defeated this threat before. In 2010, they were gone. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was destroyed. Had it not been for the Syrian civil war flaring up next door where they were able to run to, they probably would have been exterminated altogether. It wouldn't have dealt with the wider Salafist problem in the region, but the problem in Iraq was basically gone until the civil war reignited. And again, pick up the pieces of everything that we've been saying. That what did it was the alienation of the Sunni community. The Sunni community remains deeply alienated. They see Iranian-backed Shia militias, running rampant all across Iraq. I think it's clear there is ethnic cleansing, but the reports are 10 times probably even what's actually going on. Every Iraqi Sunni is terrified for justifiable reasons. As Kim has pointed out, retaking Mosul is going to be a major military operation. It seems like it would be very difficult, let's put it that way, for the Iraqi military, even retrained by the U.S., to do it on its own. It is almost certainly going to require Shia militias to retake Mosul from ISIS, unless some other force gets created, which will take a great deal longer time. The only way that happens, without further alienating the Sunni community, without driving them further into the arms of ISIS, is through the process of political reconciliation, of showing the Sunnis what they get, of what the future state will look like, and making them feel comfortable with exactly that. Until you do that, you're not going to deal with the problems of the civil war of Iraq, and until you do that, you're not going to deal with the problems of ISIS. You can look at it from the top down, you can look at it from the bottom up. They are absolutely interlinked. And it's why this rhetoric, both the popular sentiment and what comes from the White House, is so badly misguided. And if we actually practice what we're preaching, as Fred points out, we're going to make the situation worse, not better.
Okay, we're happy to take your questions. Wait for the microphone to come to you. Identify yourself and make your statement in the form of a brief question, please. We'll start over here.
Hi, my name is Nick Boros with TD International. Thanks a lot. It was really very well spoken, very eloquent. I really liked it. I guess my biggest question is, what you say makes sense. How do you get public support for what you're talking about? Because to the average person, U.S. has been involved in Iraq for over a decade. It's now an ISIS hotbed, and Iranians have taken over. So the last decade hasn't worked very well. How do you explain in kind of a, in this environment, it's super easy to make a good argument, but what do you say to the American people? Because the politicians will not do something that loses them their next election.
Here's the problem. The person who needs to say it to the American people is the President of the United States. If the President of the United States will not make a case for the right policy, then it's going to be very hard to sell it to the American people, because he's the guy who's going to execute the policy. Now, I actually think that American war weariness is softer than people imagine. The amount of sacrifice that is actually required to do what it is that we're talking about here is trivial. We're not talking about sending tens of thousands of troops into Iraq. We're not talking about spending hundreds of billions of dollars in aid and stuff. We're talking about manageable undertakings with forces that are available and financial resources, some of which we can probably get from the international community on a scale that will not bankrupt the country. So the weariness, first of all, I've always found that the American political class is more weary of this war than the American people actually are. Because just to say it again, the American people actually have no right to be war weary. The percentage of Americans who have actually been affected in the last decade by this war is not such that the average American has a right to claim to be war weary. And frankly, I don't think the average American does claim to be war weary. Politicians are war weary in the sense that they're weary of talking about this war and having to make decisions about it. And I understand that. But I actually think that resistance to this is a lot softer than people imagine. And I don't think people are going to lose elections based on advocating doing what's necessary to defeat ISIS, especially when you consider what percentage of the American people think that ISIS is the top national security threat that we face. I think politicians should lose elections down the line for inaction, wrong policies, things that lead to the next 9/11 Commission report, where we are trying to figure out how is it that something horrible happened that could have been prevented if we performed sound, due diligence here and actually a reasonable policy, but that probably won't happen either. So I really don't think this is going to decide elections.
If I could add to that, because I think Fred's made some really important points. First of all, I think he's absolutely right that it's the American elite that is war weary. I was struck by I'm perfectly willing to say I don't know what the American public thinks, although I try to talk to them as much as I possibly can. But I do look at the polls, right? And what was striking to me was that in August you had different polls out there showing opposition to American boots on the ground in Iraq and Syria at about 58-60%. After the president's speech in September, which actually I think part of the answer to your question is I think what the president said in September was exactly right. And I think that was exactly the rhetorical case to be made. And I found that it was, quite a powerful impact on the American people. The polls that were taken in October showed a dramatic change in public perceptions. And in fact, the numbers of people who opposed boots on the ground in Iraq and Syria, and I was stunned by this, I didn't expect it at all. The numbers of people who opposed boots on the ground in Syria and Iraq had fallen to about 37%. They were almost equal with the number of people who thought that we were in favor of boots on the ground in Iraq and Syria. Now, again, what boots on the ground means to different people, very different things. But just using that as a surrogate, and actually some of the polls that were done in October were really quite good in asking questions like, do you think that the U.S. should do more or do less in Iraq and Syria? The numbers were overwhelming in the 60s for do more in Iraq and Syria. So I think that actually when the president goes out and makes the case and says, look, this is important, here's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to overcommit, right? I'm not going to put huge numbers of troops in. If we're talking about boots on the ground, we're probably talking very small numbers, some special forces, JTACs, additional advisors, things like that, more air power, more military support, non-military support. The American public actually seems to be quite in favor of that. And again, I think that the case to be made is, in effect, saying what we've just said, which is we've all seen this movie before, right? Walking away from the problem doesn't make it go away. Right? The right answer is actually to engage with it, just not to over-engage necessarily the way that the Bush administration did. And as I said, I thought that the president, by and large, hit the right notes and was developing the right rhetorical approach back in September. It's just, I worry that perhaps the administration is no longer committed to what the president laid out in September. And certainly there's a number of things that need to happen on the ground that would make the policy far more consistent with what he said in September, both in Iraq and, as Fred pointed out, in particular in Syria.
I'm going to add one thing to that, which is for an administration that ran on the importance of smart power, the policies of this administration have become a caricature of the Bush administration, in that virtually the only tool that we're using in Iraq now is military power. A lot of what we talked about as being essential doesn't require any commitment from the American people at all. It requires a commitment from the White House to spend time on it and from the State Department to be allowed to spend time on it and various other actors to provide support within the government. And the degree to which our military operations, limited as they are not supported by any serious diplomatic, political, or economic, social engagement is stunning. And it really, it makes the Bush administration look like a masterpiece of interagency and all of government cooperation. In the back.
Morning, Jason Campbell with RAND. Ken, I couldn't agree more with your point on the need for political reconciliation. You said that a body wants to do the right thing but doesn't have the requisite support right now. So on the Iraq side of the equation, what needs to happen? Who needs to come around before we start seeing a more substantive discussion about reconciliation? And from the U.S. side of things, if it were to increase its diplomatic engagement, what is the status right now of America's cachet in Baghdad, particularly with respect to all of the other competing interests? And what are the points of leverage, and to what extent could it bilaterally push for a more tangible plan towards reconciliation?
Yeah, great questions, Jason, as usual. I'll start with the first point, but I think that the really interesting pieces of it are in your second question. On your first question, who is in opposition? As usual, you've got certain elements out there who are just, viscerally opposed to making a number of these compromises. Fred has named some of the names in terms of people who are against it. There are some others as well. There seems to be, we didn't get to see him, but there seems to be a lot of people around, former Prime Minister Maliki, certainly suggesting that the Prime Minister has been one of the people who has been, former Prime Minister has been one of the people who's been reticent, shall we say, about making these kinds of compromises. But as always, it's hard to know in Baghdad, right? And what we need to recognize is that so much of this is psychological, right? You know, frequently we heard both from the Prime Minister's camp and from those who opposed him and from those who kind of were somewhere in the middle or outside the process altogether, that if the Prime Minister didn't have Mosul by June, it was all over. And by all over, it was he was going to fall and the project of a unified Iraq would fail. Right? And we would ask, well, why? And you know, we would get answers like, well, you know, he'll be unseated in a vote of no confidence. To which our response was, well, how? Right? It's hard to unseat a prime minister in Iraq through a vote of no confidence. You know, back in 2012, the opposition had all the votes it needed to unseat him, and they couldn't do it. Right? And it seems even harder this time around. And again, what that speaks to, again, is just so much of this is psychological. There is a mood. There is a sense that a body doesn't have the support that he needs, and therefore nobody's willing to go with him, which creates the self-fulfilling prophecy. Right? And so much of this is about turning around the psychology of the place and creating a sense that the prime minister is strong, he is backed, he is empowered, he has everyone on his side, which typically gets everyone to move with him. But, you know, because Iraq is so fragmented, you have to have that, which is why your second question is the really interesting one out there. And, you know, I think Fred has spoken to this a little bit, I've spoken to it a little bit, Kim has spoken to this a little bit, but, you know, it's worth starting with the point that it was clear to us, and I think that it was clear to us before we went, clear to us after, everything you see, the vast majority of Iraqi political leaders are very uncomfortable with the degree of Iranian influence that they see, and also the vast majority of them would like to see the civil war ended and would like to see Iraq unified and peaceful again, right? The difficulty is in the terms, right, is in the how you do all of that stuff. But that's worth pointing out. And a lot of them, you know, you asked about the American cachet, American leverage. A lot of them were looking at us and saying, we're ready to follow if you guys would simply lead. Right? And it's why that absence that Fred was talking about, that I also mentioned, is so important. Because there is this widespread perception of we'd like to see the Americans more involved in Iraq. And if the Americans were, we'd be willing to get behind it. But we don't see that willingness on the part of the United States. And as people who have been burned so many times by the United States, at least since 2003, but arguably since 1991, there are very few Iraqi political leaders who are willing to kind of get out there until they see that commitment from the United States. And I think a lot of the requests from the Iraqi government for for more military assistance are really getting at that. I mean, yeah, I think the truth of the matter is, you know, we can certainly argue about numbers of strike sorties and even support sorties. But in terms of the military assistance that the United States is providing, numbers of advisors as well, but the equipment, we're providing a lot of equipment to the Iraqis, and it's hard to say what more the Iraqis actually need. That said, you know, I will speak only for myself. I personally would be glad to give them bunches more stuff if, again, it reinforced that psychological message of the United States is here and we're willing to arm Iraq so that you don't have to rely on Iran. Right, which that message that Fred said is a very compelling one to a lot of Iraqis, right? The Iranians arm us. The Iranians were here. The Iranians helped us when you did nothing. Until you guys step up, we're not willing to do. But then beyond that, you know, we do need to remember that most of the Iraqi political leadership, and certainly the ones that we care about, do have constituencies. And those constituencies want security, but they want other stuff as well. And as Fred pointed out, we are in a very good position, much better position than the Iranians in many ways, to provide them with that additional support. And we were struck, I think, by how much Prime Minister Abadi is focusing. You know, he's got two main strands. One is the political reconciliation. The other is reforming government and the delivery of services. And he's got some good, smart people working very energetically on that. But again, he's not getting the support that he needs. That's a great area for the United States to step in and say, here's all kinds of stuff that we can do for you. And it's not all about giving money. A lot of it is about technology and know-how and advice and a whole variety, filling out, as you and I have talked about a number of times, filling out the strategic framework agreement that we struck back in 2008, turning that into a real thing where we are actually helping the Iraqi people will be enormously important in getting additional Iraqi leaders to step up and say, yeah, the Americans are doing the right thing. We like what they're providing. Our people like it, and we will back the prime minister in reconciliation because this clearly is a smart way for Iraq to move, and there is a superpower that is now actually making it possible.
There was one consistent strain that we heard as we talked to many different Shia political leaders. And I want to bring it forward as part of the answer to this wonderful question. That strain was the Sunni are too fragmented to negotiate with and to reconcile with. In fact, one of the things that Shia politicians said to us on a regular basis was the Sunni have no marja'iyya. That is to say, they have no single Shia religious leadership, which is definitional, but is also a metaphor for how it is that Shia politicians would like to see the Sunni leadership organized. You can imagine also how depressing I found it when a Sunni leader actually said, well, you see, we have no marja'iyya, but we'll let that go and laugh at the irony of that. The point is that I actually think that it is not just a responsibility of the United States to figure out how to bring the Sunni together. I actually think that Shia political leaders have a responsibility to do that as well, and not sit around and wait for the Sunni to have a marja'iyya, because let's face it, that hasn't happened in 1,300 years, so I would say I don't think that's going to happen now. That kind of leadership will mean a lot of work. It means sitting down with a lot of different constituencies. It means not actually relying simply on the Sunni political leaders in Baghdad in order to speak for communities that are now fractured and dispersed. And it means creating a sense of leadership within the Sunni community that is viable over the long term. And so responsibility goes not just to the United States, not just to the Sunni leadership, which is not necessarily helping itself, but also to Shia leaders actually to reach out at this time.
Ambassador Filey.
Good morning. Thank you very much for delightful and comprehensive feedback. For us at the embassy, we'll be happy to facilitate for others who would like to go. I hope you felt that you had free to see whomever you want and you get that. I have a few state points which I hope you can reflect on based on what we have just heard today. First one is that I think it's, get this right. I think it's important that we recognize that Daesh or ISIS has its own self-destruct buttons because of the ideology and others. However, what we face in Iraq and in Syria is the destruction of heritage and others. And there I think it's irreversible. That's why I think we need to get rid of it as soon as possible. That's important to recognize that. Second point is regarding IDP and oil. I think, Fred, you're absolutely right. The prices of oil and others has provided us with a substantial amount of challenge. However, I think we need to support Iraq needs is to give it the breathing space for its politics and others to develop and to be able to deal with it. It's mainly that. It's not a dependent state. It's more to do with the breathing space. I would suspect it's a short term rather than long term. So it's important. Third point, I think it's important that what the support is needed is to give it more long-term strategy rather than dealing with short-term objectives. This is where the crucial aspect of it. The fight against ISIS has led us more to focus on short-term issues. I think that's where support can be of a friendship with the United States. The last 2 points is that please learn from your last decades dealing with Iraq. Please, please. And that please is not that you should abandon it or you should embrace it fully. It's just that give the politics, let it mature up, learn from those mistakes, and don't take ownership of all the problems. It's for the region to resolve. However, the support is there, I think is crucial. The last point is, which I'm very pleased to hear about the facts and perceptions regarding the army and everything else. And let me admit that, and I hope you will admit that as well. On the Iraqi side, and I might even suggest that on the American side, we have not done a good media and messaging campaign to counter that. That needs to take place. Otherwise, somebody, one of the militia guys, putting his flag on a tank and projecting that this tank belonged to them is an issue. We need to do better, and you can help us with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I do want to say that we did feel that we had complete freedom. Actually, Ken did almost all of the reaching out to the people that we wanted to see. We were not constrained in any way, and the Prime Minister's office facilitated us seeing anyone that we wanted to see and helped us get other meetings. So I would encourage anyone who is willing to go over there. And by the way, Baghdad, you might not believe this, but Baghdad is more peaceful than I have ever seen it.
Me too.
I mean, it was unbelievable, and you would not, I think, get that from the news. We had the opportunity our last night there to eat at a restaurant in a mall on the southern side of the Karada Peninsula, for those of you who know what that is, which is sort of basically still in the green zone. So I mean, it's technically not, but it's basically still in the green zone. But it was remarkable. The mall was hopping. There were people of all ages. Some women were covered, some were not, which is an indicator that we look for, among other things, because Iraqi, Baghdadi women will tend to go both ways on that naturally. And we saw a good mix. We saw people being very comfortable and being very calm, and a sense of calm in the city that I've never experienced before. Now, I don't want to oversell that. We have Daesh sleeper cells in Baghdad. We have some very lightly sleeping Daesh cells outside of Baghdad, and we have some very wide awake Daesh cells trying to get into Baghdad, and I'm sure that there will continue to be explosions and violence and so forth. That having been said, the Baghdad that we visited was not at all the Baghdad that I expected, and I think that it is safe for people to travel in the way that we did anyway, and at least meet with the political leaders and talk with them and some of the military leaders. And I think it's important to do that because I agree entirely with the ambassador. The messaging such as it has been, both from the United States and from the Iraqi government about this, has been abysmal as generous. Non-existent is more like. And what we've discovered, one of the lessons that we need to learn, and thank you, Ambassador, for reminding us of this, one of the lessons we've learned is that when there's a war going on and there's no messaging from the leadership, the only thing that people see are booms. And the only news they get is bad news, because that's the default set, because people living their lives peacefully in Baghdad is not much of a story, unfortunately. So unless somebody makes an effort, and this should be the U.S. and the White House, but it also needs to be the Iraqi government and security services to get the story out, we're not going to get there. A last point I want to make on the issue of lessons learned. There is a lesson that we, the United States, need to learn. I don't see why we should now, because we have refused to learn it for decades. And the Iraqi leadership needs to learn also, which is the limitations of talking to the people who happen to present themselves as leaders of a community. We fall for this trap every time. They're usually expats. In our case, they're usually the people who dress very well, speak beautiful English, and spend a lot of time in Washington and London and Paris and Brussels and so forth. And we engage with these people, and they're very engaging and they're very sincere, some of them. And a lot of them, some sincerely believe that they can actually deliver their communities. Very few of them actually can. That's also true if you're sitting in Baghdad and you never travel to Anbar. If you are a Shia political leader and you're in Baghdad and you don't go to Anbar and see the tribes who are fighting on the ground, then you don't know who the actual leaders are. Because when there's a war going on, leadership naturally emerges among the people who are fighting. And that is the leadership that the people tend to look to after the war is over or as the war is being resolved. If those people are not engaged and you try to do an elite political settlement with people who weren't there, you're going to have a major problem. And that's something that both Iraqis and Americans need to learn. In our case, we need to learn it not just for Iraq.
Thank you very much for great, insightful comments. Alexander Kravitz from Insight Iraq. I have a question for Mr. Kagan. You said for the U.S. to make a contribution that Iran can't match. I'm wondering if you could spell it out a bit. For Mrs. Kagan, I wonder if you could speculate on what a premature operation to liberate Mosul could mean, meaning that it's premature, it fails, what that scenario could be. And for Mr. Pollack, I wonder if you could comment on the current financial crisis and its implications on the Baghdad-Erbil recent agreements on, the oil and whatnot. Thank you.
All right, great question. I'll try to keep my answer brief, but characterize what I think a failed operation in Mosul could look like and what its consequences could be. If, in fact, conditions are not set to have to secure Mosul and its population from ISIS within, we are going to have a problem. ISIS will use Iraqi civilians as human shields. ISIS will actually put itself in places whereby our airstrikes or Iraqi artillery will actually damage more of the cultural heritage of Iraq. We can see ISIS actually destroying more infrastructure, and all of that can ultimately result in a hard fight that perhaps actually does ultimately lead to the recovery of the city, but can lead to the recovery of the city in a way that actually destroys the urban center and the population living there, or leaves the city either in control of Shia militias, in control of Kurds, who we have to remember actually had a very aggressive presence inside of Mosul city back in the 2007-2008 timeframe, and who might actually feel as though clearing eastern Mosul would be good for the Kurdish region. So we can actually see conditions being set inadvertently for continued ethnic as well as sectarian conflict in Mosul. If, in fact, the wrong forces go in, or if, in fact, the preparations are not made once the city is liberated, actually to hold it and to begin to rebuild it. I think that ISIS, once expelled from Mosul, should it be, will in fact try to get back in and will in fact try to use its presence inside of Syria and elsewhere in Iraq actually to conduct a consistent terrorist offensive against Mosul. And furthermore, that ISIS has the capability as of now to consolidate, to regroup, and to attack into other areas in order to divert resources and security forces from Mosul. So overall, this means that the campaign for Mosul actually needs to be planned, it needs to be sophisticated, and it needs to be conducted by legitimate security forces who are not bringing with them a sectarian or ethnic agenda.
So here at Critical Threats Project, one of the things that we do is track Iranian statements very, very closely. And so I am aware of all of the Iranian claims to have matched or surpassed the United States in military capability and the size and power and reach of their armed forces. They're largely amusing. In the real world, the Iranians cannot provide precision air power. They cannot provide mine-resistant vehicles. In fact, they are the world's leading expert in building new mines and new forms of IEDs to kill vehicles, but they really, since they are the principal producer of that, haven't focused so much on how to defend against it. They do not, despite their claims to have reverse-engineered the CIA drone that they captured, have sophisticated intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capability. They do not have sophisticated abilities to analyze large amounts of intelligence. They just succeeded in putting a hunk of metal into space, possibly. They do not have satellite capabilities. There's a whole range of technical capabilities that the United States has that Iran cannot provide to Iraq. And the Iranians don't regard that as a problem because they don't use that stuff. As I said, they have a very different way of fighting. The Iraqi army prefers to do a counterinsurgency campaign as we do, relying on those kinds of capabilities. It would be enormous leverage. It is enormous leverage with them, actually, that we are providing them to the extent that we are now. Another thing, if Iraq needs money, Iran is not exactly cash rich. And until and unless the sanctions are actually lifted, the Iranians are not going to be floating the Iraqi economy. And frankly, I have to say, knowing the Iranians, even if sanctions are lifted, they won't be floating the Iraqi economy either. The Iranians are an isolated element in the international community. They cannot mobilize a broad coalition to support Iraq. On the contrary, the more that Iraq drifts into their orbit, the more potential partners are alienated from Iraq. The more we get involved, the more we bring other partners with other capabilities, and the more we can bring Iraq into the international community. Moving into the realm of soft power, the Iraqis would like to have first world technology for oil extraction and hydrocarbon processing, not the homemade do-it-yourself third world technology that the Iranians have to offer, or frankly even that the Chinese have to offer. We could encourage Western companies to invest. We could bring technical capabilities and experts of various sorts to help. Done it in the past. It's something that the Iranians can't do. Needless to say, Iraqi young students are not clamoring to go to the University of Mashhad. They would rather go to Harvard. We have the ability, if we would actually implement the Strategic Framework Agreement and develop a partnership between nations, to offer access to a lot of things that Iraqis want that the Iranians just don't have.
Fred, I'm going to overlook the fact that you said Harvard there for a minute ago. It's 3 Yale alums. It's painful. Before I answer your question about the financial, I can't help. I just want to add a point about the scenarios for Mosul. I have to do the political stuff up here, but I'm also an old military analyst, and it hurts not to. And we actually had some really interesting conversations on the trip about this. But I would just take Kim's points and I'd reframe them slightly to say, I think broadly speaking, we saw a number of different, lots of different scenarios. Brought 3 different families of scenarios for failure for Mosul. To use historical analogies, one is where Kim started out, which is kind of the Stalingrad analogy, right? Daesh digs in, and it is a horrific fight. And let's keep in mind the political dimensions of that, which again is, if the Sunni community sees the Iraqi forces coming in, I'm going to put quotations around Iraqi, as being nothing but a bunch of Shia, because it's a combination of Shia militias and an overwhelmingly Shia Iraqi military. And let's remember, the Iraqi army and police right now are still overwhelmingly Shia in terms of actual manpower. And if they come in and the Sunnis perceive them as being nothing but a partisan force, they will probably fight alongside of Daesh to defend it. And then you can have the Stalingrad scenario, which would just be catastrophic. Another one is, maybe kind of a Warsaw 44 scenario, where, we've heard any number of Sunni leadership from Mosul talking about, their plan, which is they want to rise up in the city and liberate the city before the Shia get there. right? Another problem would be if that is not properly coordinated because the political context has not been set, as Kim and I have both been talking about, the Shia could just basically allow those people to be slaughtered by Daesh. And then come in, or they may come in and slaughter them themselves, right? So the city does eventually fall, but the situation is even worse because you've crushed the indigenous forces, right? And a third scenario is kind of Baghdad 2003, which is the Shia, the military with militias, without militias, is able to overrun the city. But again, because you have not reconciled with the local population, they regard that force coming in as an occupying force and develops an insurgency against them. All three of those, and again, you can come up with all kinds of different variants on those scenarios, but all three would be disastrous for Mosul and for Iraq. Now to your point about the financial stuff and the Erbil-Baghdad agreement. And you're already seeing it, right? Meshirvan Barzani gave a speech, I think just yesterday, in which he pointed out that the government is not delivering on the promise of the funds to be transferred and that this, isn't going to last. And this is the problem is I think that the Baghdad-Erbil agreement was a very important one. We should all recognize that it's not a permanent solution to the problems between the KRG and the central Iraqi government. It was an important temporary measure, which I think could become the basis for a more permanent settlement if there were goodwill and a willingness to compromise on both sides. But as your question is kind of implying, the problem is that the financial crisis is destroying that, because neither side really has any slack in its system. Neither side can afford to allow the other side to renege by the slightest bit, despite the fact that both sides have real problems right now delivering because of those financial problems. The Kurds are having problems meeting their budget. The central government is having problems meeting its budget. And so both sides are kind of demanding that the other live up to the terms and live up to them first. And that creates a situation in which there isn't a whole lot of goodwill and a whole lot of slack in the system. And just to kind of piggyback on Fred's point, this is another area, as Fred was already implying, where the United States can be enormously helpful. As Ambassador Faley pointed out, Iraq has both some immediate short-term needs and longer-term needs. And the financial situation is related to both of them. On the one hand, Iraq does have a very severe cash crunch, and the United States can lead the international financial community. The IMF and the World Bank will respond to the United States. They won't respond to Iran. This would be a great moment for the United States to step in and provide some short-term financial support for Iraq, bridging loans and things like that to basically allow them to get through this moment of financial hardship. But we also do need to be thinking about Iraq's long-term finances and its future. And it's, again, another area where the United States can be enormously helpful. One of the big issues that's going to come up, again, related to this is that a lot of the Iraqi oil contracts are expiring this year. Others, there are fields that need to be put under tender. It's likely that Baghdad will have another bid round. The problem is that right now, there's, on the one hand, a recognition that the contracts that were let several years ago were damaging to Iraq because they weren't generous enough to the multinational oil corporations who've been very, very reluctant to actually engage with Iraq the way that the Iraqi government hoped. So that would suggest being more generous with the terms to the oil companies. The problem is the financial crisis is pushing Baghdad in the opposite direction to say, give less to the oil companies, take more. And there's one last piece of this. There's a plan afoot in Baghdad to unilaterally restructure a lot of the existing oil contracts to basically defer payments, which again would be very helpful to the Iraqi government in the short term, but again is not going to be very helpful if they go out with another bid round to companies who feel like, you guys just unilaterally restructured those old deals and pushed the money on us further back. Why should we go in with you on new deals? Again, another area where the U.S. can be very helpful.
So I'm afraid I'm going to have to wrap it up here. I want to make one last observation because this comes up a lot. I'm grateful to my fellow panelists, and I'm also grateful to the audience, as usual, for coming here and having a thoughtful discussion with us, asking thoughtful, meaningful questions, and trying to understand what's going on in Iraq and what's the right thing to do. It's in stark contrast to the way that a lot of the discussions about Iraq are being had. And I want to highlight something that you did not hear today from any of us and won't hear from any of us. No one is advocating re-invading Iraq. No one is advocating putting 200,000 troops in Iraq forever. That is not, in fact, the alternative to the current strategy, even though the president keeps saying that it is. There's actually very little reason not to do the right thing in Iraq. The cost to the United States is not outrageous or extreme, and it is not, in fact, a slippery slope down to having another 200,000 troops in Iraq for the rest of eternity. That's not what's required. It won't be required if we do the right thing. So one of the things I'd ask you to do is, as you go away and you talk to other people, do please try to inject a sense of reality into what options are actually being offered on the table so that we can have a serious discussion about what to do and what not to do without painting everybody as either a complete surrender monkey or someone who just enjoys invading places for the heck of it. Because the truth is no one is actually in either place. And we could craft a policy that the United States could afford and that the American people could support that could make a difference. Would it definitely work? Of course it wouldn't definitely work. It's a war. You can never be certain. Could it work? Yeah. Do we have an important interest in having it work? Very much so. And the top lesson that we should learn from the last 30 years of American history is that walking away from countries in these situations leads to greater disaster down the road and greater engagement and greater cost in American lives, in local lives, and in treasure. And it's something that we have to stop doing. Thank you all very much for coming. Thanks to the Institute for the Study of War for co-hosting us today. Have a wonderful day.